So now this afternoon is I think the last RCI-POD for our department, our division. So it's quite exciting for everyone because we're now going to be off on the holidays after this one. This afternoon, we will dive deeper into trade and trade finance and discuss the factors holding back its development. We will also examine how digitalization can help overcome those challenges and be instrumental in promoting inclusive and sustainable growth in Asia and the Pacific region. So to start us off this afternoon, I would like to call on the Regional Cooperation and Integration Division's Director, Sinyang Park. Sinyang, you have the floor.
Okay. Thank you, Arali. Good afternoon, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very pleased to welcome you all to this webinar on driving inclusive digitalization and trade finance. We have witnessed the significant disruptions to trade and supply chain, especially during the COVID-19 crisis. Among all despairs and disruptions, digitalization seems to rise as one of the brightest silver lining. While recovery is underway, its prospects remain uncertain by geopolitical tensions, oil and commodity prices driven inflation, and rising interest rates to tame that inflation, and other growing headwinds. Trade did recover, but the prospects also get really threatened by these growing headwinds. Trade finance revealed often vulnerable during the economic crisis. The availability of trade finance is particularly critical to trade, and especially during this weak prospects of trade recovery. The shortage of trade finance during the crisis often threatens to worsen the trade decline and also stop short of trade recovery going forward. While banks continue to have good balance sheets and extended period of low interest rates coming up to here, indicate that the liquidity has not been a major issue for the bank. We are facing a different environment going forward. Driven by the US Fed, the global interest rates have been going upward for some time. As interest rates are rising, the investors' risk appetite will also dwindle. That is going to pose a significant risk to trade finance amid increased economic uncertainties and high cost for the bank provisions. Public sector, including export credit agencies and multilateral banks, need to step up their support to increase access to trade finance. Digitalization offers great opportunities by lowering the cost of banking intermediation and also allow banks follow that meet the requirement of KYC and AML with much lower cost, hopefully, and greater efficiency. More importantly, we need to also step up utilizing this benefit of digital financial systems to increase the access to trade finance and lower the cost. We may also help this with better data and allowing the technology. This webinar provides a good opportunity to discuss the opportunities and challenges of using digital technology to narrow the trade finance gap. I also look forward to discussing the policy considerations that will be needed in helping the banks and also SMEs in making the trade finance market more efficient. Again, welcome to this webinar, and I look forward to productive and fruitful discussions during the webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, Sinya. Um, that was a very nice lead into our discussion this afternoon. So, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to call on the senior economist of ERCD to provide us his discussion on on the same topic as the title of this RCI pod, driving inclusive digitalization in trade and trade finance. Our speaker actually is has done extensive work on trade facilitation, trade finance. He's an expert in the field, and he's our senior economist and our favorite OPA, Kijin Kim.
Thank you very much, Aleli. I really like the introduction. Is it full screen now? Okay, thank you. So, good afternoon, good morning, everyone. My name is Kijin. So my presentation is actually based on our latest policy brief that went down 2 days ago. So I'll try to make a 10-minute quick summary of this policy brief. Okay, as you know, the pandemic acted as a catalyst in accelerating digitalization, arising from mobility restrictions, shrinking profit margins, and productivity. Online marketplaces showed two-digit growth rates even during COVID-19. A survey by World Bank shows that the pandemic has led to an increase in demand and usage for digital financial services around the world. Um, Global economic growth and trade volumes recovered in 2021, but they are expected to moderate in 2022 and 23 as high inflation and rising economic financial risks increase trade costs. And regarding financing conditions in trade, unmet demand or rejected trade finance applications has been persistently large, standing at around $1.7 trillion as of 2020. That accounts for 10% of world's trade, and it will likely worsen moving forward. Okay, various national and international initiatives are gaining ground in driving digitalization. This is happening quite fast recently. For example, all 10 ASEAN member states are now digitally connected via the ASEAN single window. And Singapore tries to accelerate the process of trade digitalization through digital economic agreements. And G7 economies approved in 2021 a declaration on digital trade principles that encourage digital trading systems. And very recently, 2 weeks ago, Republic of Korea adopted the framework agreement on facilitation of cross-border paperless trade. And now 11 economies are participating in the framework. And United States and the United Kingdom, major trading partners to many countries, are going through legal reforms to ensure digital documents like electronic bill of lading have functionally equivalent to paper documents in trade. So I'd like to highlight that currently trade and trade finance transactions face three major challenges. So the first one is that the paper is still widely used, despite our hard push for digitalization. For example, bills of lading, which is one of the fundamental documents in all trade transactions, only around 1% of them went digital, which is quite surprising. Paper is also common, as in letters of credit transactions, that involves a number of parties and documentation for verification and information exchange. And the second factor is that regulatory requirements, for example, know your customer and anti-money laundering compliance raise the cost for banks in providing loans and guarantees. They also incentivize them to reject less bankable applications. And another factor that raises trade costs is due to information asymmetry. So as banks rely on previous banking relationships, financial statements, and collateral, SMEs may not be able to meet any of these requirements, which could ultimately lead to failed trade transactions. Okay. Uh, and next slide. So let me talk a little bit more about SME's difficulty in getting finance. SME's application for trade finance are more likely to be rejected than larger firms. For example, our ADB's trade finance survey finds that SMEs accounted for 23% of trade finance applications, but for 40% of total trade finance rejections. Smaller firms have difficulties in fulfilling the requirement that I mentioned in earlier slides, and the bank enforce such requirements at higher rates as the higher risk is associated with smaller firms. And moreover, firms, once they're rejected, they have difficulty accessing alternative financing, which makes them relying on business partners, family, and relatives instead. Okay, so current economic climate is compelling businesses to adopt digitalization for cost saving. It could help address the three challenges that I mentioned earlier. Process efficiency can improve by speeding up transactions and reducing human error. Technology such as distributed ledger technology, AI, and big data can help verify business identity and financial capacity. And digitalization improves transparency and traceability in supply chains, which is especially important during the times of emergency like the pandemic. And sustainable reporting on environmental, social, and governance or ESG criteria will also require digitalization for accurate monitoring. But the reality is that despite benefits, the scope of digitalization remains limited. For example, banks, including small ones, they tend to use technologies mainly for digital filing and transmissions, as well as electronic signatures. And firms, they use it for digital record keeping and accounting. And Asia has made significant progress in trade facilitation, but full implementation of paperless trade is a bit far away. In UNSCAP's survey on trade facilitation implementation, among various measures in trade facilitation, cross-border paperless trade facilitation, like exchange of electronic trade documents, is lagging behind. And the same study shows that trade finance facilitation has room for improvement. So on digitalization uptake for banks, for example, banks are concerned about the high cost of technology, lack of globally established standards and rules, lack of expertise and interoperability. And I think these factors should not be very different when we look at other players in trade. When it comes to limited common rules and interoperabilities, it creates digital islands, resulting in lost opportunities for trade and development. And part of the reason is that there is no common legal backing that applies across border. For example, UN's model law on electronic transfer of records, there are only 7 jurisdictions that have adopted it, and 3 of them are in Asia and the Pacific. They all of them adopted recently in 2021 and 2022. So in my last slides, I want to discuss what are the then main policy areas to deal with issue. First, so we need to make sure MLETR or the model law or equivalent legislation is adopted in as many countries as possible, so that electronic trade documents such as electronic bill of lading can be legally recognized among the countries that adopt the law. And it is promising that large economies like the UK and US are joining the forces, and China is also showing great interest in adopting this. And second, We should address digital island problem by adopting international standards that governs trade processes. For example, the Digital Standards Initiative launched by ICC, ADB, and Enterprise Singapore in 2020, it can serve as a platform for global collaboration. And thirdly, we should further promote green and inclusive trade through digitalization and environmental, social, and governance consideration. Much of the world's carbon emissions is coming from global supply chain activities, and policymakers must create accessible incentives and sustainable financing tools to implement ESG, especially for SMEs. And last but not least, closing the digital disparity will also require greater effort for skills development and building capacities to acquire technologies. Such effort can be complemented by support from international organizations like ADB. Thank you, and you could find more detailed discussion in our brief. So I'll stop here. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Kijin, for that interesting presentation. We now move on to our panel discussion. And while everyone may be raring to ask their questions, I would like to request you to hold your horses and start um, forming your questions. But maybe you'll have more after hearing from our panelists. So to lead us into this panel discussion, we have the director from the Regional Cooperation and Operations Coordination Division of CWRD, Director Yaziza Sabirova. The floor is yours now.
Thank you very much, Alili, Sinyong, and Kijin. Thank you very much for inviting me to this very interesting webinar with very interesting policy brief and all the background information on this topic. I mean, I think we cannot underestimate the importance of all these things. So I'm the moderator, and we have a very distinguished and very interesting panel with a lot of experience, a lot of knowledge behind each one of you. So I hope we will have an interesting discussion today. So first I will introduce each you to our audience. And if I understand correctly, we have more than 50 people as of now in this seminar. I think those are people, well, obviously ADB staff, but also I understand we have people from our DMCs, our countries, which is very good, also from our resident missions. And then we'll have some questions that I will pose to you. With luck, we can have maybe 3 rounds of questions or discussion, but also please feel free to react yourselves to questions that I pose to your peer panelists. Let's just have a conversation about that. With introduction, maybe I'll try to do that. And I'll probably in this session introduce all of you. And our audience will have access to all your detailed bios. So maybe I'll do a little bit shorter version. So I'll start with Hanan Nguyen, who is the Director of Digital Ecosystems, ICC Digital Standards Initiative, which is, I would guess, International Commerce, Chamber of Commerce, DSI, sorry. So with all years of experience in global trade and supply chains, Hannah is a champion for digitalization. And in her role as a director of digital systems right now, she's really working very closely with industry stakeholders, with standards development organizations, governments, private sector also in promoting policy coherence and harmonization of digital trade standards for the benefits of businesses, governments, and people everywhere. So she also co-authored with the WTO the first ever standards toolkit for cross-border paperless trade, quite an achievement. And previously she was with a Steinweg group that resulted in significant expansions for commodity logistics business. So she has a lot of experience in Southeast Asia, in private sector and so on. So we are very pleased to have you, Hannah, in our panel. Another panelist is Carmen Maria Ramirez Ortiz. And Carmen is now a part of ADB Trade and Supply Chain Finance team, and she's working as a relationship manager. The objective of this program and her role is to increase supply chain finance business footprint by engaging with multiple global and regional banks in various geographies and regions. And as part of her work in ADB, she's also a lead in trade digitalization initiative. Prior to joining ADB, Carmen worked at the Spanish embassy in the Philippines as an ADB liaison officer. So welcome, Carmen, to our panel. The third panelist is, again, our own ADB's staff, a senior digital technology specialist, Uni Jong. I think I understand Uni just recently joined ADB, if I understand it correctly. But behind her experience, she was a public policy professional with nearly 20 years of international experience in digital technologies overall in Asia, Pacific, and Africa also. And prior to joining ADB, Uni was the director of public and regulatory affairs with the Telenor Group, of course, a global mobile operator. And in her previous life, she worked as a consultant with World Bank and UNESCO, and also a director of research, and also she was in consultancy, TRPC, which is an advisory firm. So welcome, Uni, to our panel. And last, certainly not the least, again, our own staff, principal economist in Southeast Asia Regional Department, James Villafuerte. Many of us know James. He's a good colleague, and he's now conducting research on economics and regional cooperation issues in Southeast Asia. And he also leads the CERT, which stands for those people who are outside of ADB, Southeast Asia Regional Department Policy Network of Economists. So James regularly writes economic outlook and risk assessments for Southeast Asia, also examines medium-term macroeconomic outlook, policy, developmental issues, including obviously on COVID-19 recovery, global value chain participation, and many, many other things. Prior to joining ADB, James was an economist at the World Bank, and also a senior economist at the Department of Treasury and Finance in Victoria. So I hope I made justice to a brief introduction, but again, I urge our audience to go back to the web page, which is a very nice web page for the seminar in ERCD website, and look a little bit more on that. All right, so let me start. Maybe I'll start with questions to Hannah. But before that, following Alili, I'd like to invite the audience to write your questions in the chat box. I will try to monitor, and maybe Alili and Kijin could also help me to do that. So we can also voice our audience questions to you guys, and to have this conversation about very interesting topic. All right, so Hannah, I have a question for you. So the way we understand ICC Digital Standards Initiative is really to promote policy coherence and harmonizing digital trade standards. So maybe for those of us or those of people in the audience who are not very familiar with the DSI initiative, maybe you can very briefly update us about the progress. And I understand it was launched just recently, 2 years ago in 2020. So what has been achieved? What is really the purpose? Maybe you can look back at these 2 years and reflect on lessons learned, and also what are the plans of this organization, of this initiative in the short and longer term. So Hannah, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for that great question, and thank you so much for the opportunity to be here as well. I think my camera is not working, but I'm still here, so I hope that you can still hear me. And I see Carmen is smiling, so I hope you can hear me still.
Yeah, we can hear you. Yeah, we
yes.
cannot see you, but we hear you very well. Yeah.
Great. Okay. So a great question about, the progress so far since our launch in 2020. And I think I must also thank Kijin for doing a very great job just now, summarizing some of the key issues that remains to be tackled as an ecosystem, as we really want to move global trade and supply chain into the digital age. So as Kijin rightly summarized, as we started this digital standards initiative with seed funding from the Asian Development Bank and the government of Singapore back in 2020, we really focus on solving 3 key issues. Number 1 is, of course, legal obstacles towards going digital. Number 2, lack of or perception of the lack of standards to help us do that. And thirdly, connecting the existing digital islands that already existed out there. So in the last 18 months or so, we have really focused on, tackling all these issues in terms of a structural level. And what do I mean by that? So for instance, earlier this year, to tackle the issue of perception of lack of standards, we actually published together with the WTO, the Standards Toolkit for Cross-Border Paperless Trade. So that is the first landscape survey that we actually undertook in order to surface the most regularly used and internationally recognized standards that could help us connect today, right? So that's the first step. But of course, we understand it's a journey and there may be potential gaps or upgrades or maintenance needed to some of these standards. Or maybe there are new standards that need to be created because some of these flows didn't exist before. And so going forward, the next question, what's our next plan, right? So going forward, what we're having and what we are working on right now is actually doing horizontal analysis of all the different standards already out there and see whether we need to have, a consensus or harmonization of certain data sets that underlies different trade documents, right? And also similarly, we need to think about, with all these standards, do we also need to articulate certain principles or protocols that will help us create a trusted technology environment for the data to actually flow through in a reliable and trusted, secure manner. So those are some of the things that we are doing to advance the work that is already done in the past 20 months into the near and medium term. Similarly, in terms of legal reform, as Kijin mentioned, a large part of the solution lies in actually getting more jurisdictions around the world to adopt the model law on electronic transferable records, or MLETR. And that is something that, we initially tackled that in terms of setting up a structure. A legal reform advisory board was set up earlier this year, and we're very happy to have already convened the power of the multilateral development banks, including ADB, and also the regional economic communities and our global network to actually get more countries and regions to really seriously undertake action to adopt the model law. So in the short and medium term, in this coming year, actually, we are doing right now with Carmen's team is really, scale up on capacity building for various member states and emerging economies who are actually ready on that journey. And in the medium term, what we want to do is really multiply this model that we have successfully, co-created with ADB, so that this same model can be applied in other regions of the world as well. To tackle the last part of your question, what are the lessons learned? I think what we have learned in this past 2 years is really the importance of building the coalition of the willing, and that includes both the public and the private sector. The importance of partnerships. So really, going with the people who are already on board in terms of the vision that make things so much easier, but also continuously, multiply champions and elevate others that may need more help along the way. And for that, I think capacity building is something that we continuously focus on, and really appreciated the opportunity to have actually partnered with both the Asian Development Bank and UNESCAP in a series of paperless trade webinars that actually went through the summer of last year until this year. And so that I think that's some very good examples of the things that have worked in the past, and we continue to do it, but also looking forward, to really build progress year after year towards that vision of trying to digitalize world trade up to, let's say, 80% within 5 years. We need really a very large ecosystem willingness, but also like an anchor platform that actually enables people to work together better, to learn lessons, and to think about how we can do things smarter and better. And so for that reason, I'm also very excited about the fact that next year in 2023, we are holding our very own global event called Future Trade Forum, happening in Singapore in the end of March. And that is where you will see, not just the progress updates about what has been achieved under the DSI with our global partners, public and private sector, but also the entire launch of a work program and workshops and collaboration opportunities for everyone to actually get on board and move the needle together. Thank you.
Thank you, Hannah. Very interesting and very good overview. And I'm sure that our people heard a lot of information in what you said. So it's maybe not a question, but maybe I'll just pose it as you were talking. And I'm sure that this question will pop up in several times maybe today. And we also heard from Kijin's presentation and then also in Sinyong's remarks is that we are working in countries at very different levels of development, obviously. And you did mention now for countries, for those who are ready to go along this journey. So maybe not a question for you right now, but something that we can maybe reflect during this discussion is really on the capacity building that you mentioned. I think this aspect is very important, again, given the different levels of awareness, of development in these areas, and also how to ensure that our countries from different regions, they really talk with one voice. Or someone may even ask, do they need to talk in one voice in all this agenda and all this question? So also coalition of the willing, I really liked that phrase that you mentioned, and I think it's also important kind of advocacy work that you are doing with your team. So thank you for putting this context for us. And I think that also leads me now quite logically and with a good transition to work of multilateral development institutions, such as, for example, ADB. And maybe now I'll go to Carmen, actually, working on trade and supply finance. And of course, we know that your team, Carmen, did so much. I mean, really what you guys have done during COVID time, during the pandemic to mitigate bottlenecks in supply chains, especially for very critical goods at that time was quite amazing. And I know that your team actually has done quite a lot also in the region where I work, in Central and West Regional Department. And I think Stephen from PSOD and their team has been really quite instrumental. So my question really to you, Carmen, is that what are the future plans, especially from this context that we are discussing today, from enabling recovery in supply chains, because we all know we are not out of woods yet. And also, since we've heard a couple of times today already the importance of these tools for SMEs. So what are the plans that your team and what ADB is doing for inclusiveness for SMEs? Floor is yours, Carmen, please.
Thank you, and thanks for having me. So indeed, during the COVID-19, the SCFP did ramp up the support, and as other multilateral did, because ADB research, the research that Kijin was actually mentioning before, the ADB's Trade Finance Gap Growth and Job Survey indicated that The gaps arising from funding available and demand of financing has continued to grow, especially during the pandemic. So our research is estimated at $1.7 trillion in 2021 versus the $1.5 trillion in 2020. And especially during this year, ERCD also estimated that this gap continued to grow to at least $2 trillion in 2021. And of course, during 2020, given uncertainty, geopolitical tensions, inflation, it's likely way beyond the 2 trillion now. So we really think we will continue to play a large role as we can in the trade finance market, but it's clear market intervention is not enough. So we need to work towards a major overhaul of the global trading system itself, and not just to kind of promote growth and create jobs, which is kind of our key mandate, but also to ensure some of the most important issues that we face as a society are also addressed, issues like fair labor practices or climate change. And we really think driving digitalization it's key for addressing these two issues and monitoring of labor. So what we will do, what have been done so far is engaging with the DSI. So as Hannah kind of put very rightly the background, in 2020 we launched this initiative together with the ICC and the government of Singapore. And while this is umbrella covering two work stream standards and legislation, we are now very engaged with the DSI, but also with other developing partners like the ANCITRAL and also the ICC to ramp up the support. So we think it's critical, and it will address some key issues, as for instance, what Kijin mentioned about participation of SMEs in global trade. So this is our kind of major target and will continue to be our major target for the years to be.
Yeah, thank you, Carmen. Very interesting and again, very useful work that you and your team are doing, and good luck with that. And you mentioned also uncertainty these days, including geopolitical uncertainty. And I think us in Central and West Asia, again, those working in Central Asia and South Caucasus, we probably know like no other people what you mean by geopolitical uncertainty. And I attest to that, working in the region, that a lot of private sector firms, entrepreneurs, they are facing big challenges in the supply chains. And everything that can smooth out, can really lubricate their activities better and easier would be very useful. But also have to know that in our view, private sector adjusted very quickly in this region, and firms started to look for alternative supply chains. And of course, now the for example, whole transportations or transit through Russian Federation very often is under sanctions. For example, Russian railways under sanctions and so on. So a lot of firms and businesses and also governments, they really kind of proved to be very agile, and they started to adjust very quickly. Anyway, but I think what you mentioned also about SMEs, your work there, that actually leads me to next panelist that I would like to ask now, Uni. And of course, when I introduced Uni, I said that she's working in our SDCC, Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department. She's a senior digital technology specialist. And Uni, we did again touched on today on the divide between large and small firms, right? So there is certainly a gap. We all know that there is a gap in the digitalization adoption between large and small firms. And maybe intuitively we kind of sort of understand why it is happening, but maybe you can put it for us in a little bit more analytical kind of frame. What explains such digital divide? But most importantly, what does ADB needs to do to make sure that such gap is reduced and that really the benefits of digitalization is shared among small and medium-sized enterprises, but also micro MSMEs, micro-sized enterprises as well, if possible. I also wanted to ask you about digital divide between countries, but maybe we'll leave it for the next round.
Yes, I would appreciate that, because these are all complex issues, and also the factors are quite interdependent. But let me answer the first question first. Which are the barriers? And digitalization of SMEs is actually on top of a lot of our clients' minds. I recently went to Vietnam and Cambodia, and you can't have a conversation with the Ministry of Information or Technology without having a conversation about how to promote digitalization of SMEs. But as you mentioned, the technology adoption at a firm level really varies, and the gap between the large firms and small firms persists despite the attention that it's getting. But in order to understand the barriers, it's actually important for us to understand the drivers of technology adoption, which are important to sort of unpack the black box of a firm, so that we can design the policies to accelerate the adoption as well as remove the barriers. Largely, we can think of the adoption drivers as external to the firms and the ones that are internal to the firms. So obviously the ones that are external to the firms consist of infrastructure. Digital infrastructure plays a large role, but transportation, electricity, they all play an important role in driving technology adoption. But factors such as competition, demand of the market, regulations is also an important driver. Access to finance, so we are going back to perennial problem of SMEs, but also supply of knowledge and human capital, which are not necessarily within the control of the firms. Both drivers, but obviously once you flip that, become a key barriers. When it comes to the factors that are internal to the firms, we're really talking about the capabilities of firms. Therefore, SMEs have a lot of deficiencies in capability. And this can range from managerial skills to digital skills, as well as know-how skills, and also their own orientations and biases around digital and digital technologies in general. Right. The body of literature around the barriers for firm-level adoption is quite large, but I wanted to refer to one of the latest survey done by World Bank called Firm-Level Adoption of Technology, that survey that looked at 11 countries, some of which did include Asia, but I think it provides a good general picture of the barriers that the firms face. So interestingly, the barriers itself that small firms and large firms face are similar. I think the key lesson here is that for smaller firms, because they're lean, they don't have the fat or buffer in terms of financing and capabilities, it affects the smaller firms more. So among this multiplicity of barriers, some of the top factors that SMEs have singled out were lack of demand and uncertainty. So demand means local demand, as well as uncertainty, which includes the political environment that we're in, lack of capabilities for infrastructure, lack of finance, and government regulations. So wanted to quickly just touch upon just some of this. When it comes to infrastructure, as mentioned, it's not just the digital infrastructure, digital connectivity, but transportation, electricity also play a big role. But in some of the survey results show that the access, the distance to high quality internet backbone, for example, was a significant factor in adopting digital technologies. right? So it sort of signifies the centrality of digital infrastructure and digital connectivity in promoting digital adoption of the firms in general. Regulations, when it comes to competition, smoothing the market dynamics, we all know that play an important role. But when it comes to digital, some of the regulatory issues were seen to be as barriers when it comes to adopting more data-intensive technologies. And we're talking about more digital platforms that utilize user data or other perhaps non-personal data to provide customized and smart services. But if there are perceived to be regulatory barriers, firms tend not to or tend to wait till there's a clarity. Access to finance, we already mentioned it, but again, this is where the small firms are disproportionately affected by lack of finance when it comes to the ability to get a loan, for example, to acquire machines or software, right? And lack of capabilities, again, I think we, as you mentioned, we intuitively know that SMEs have more limited access to capabilities. But one interesting factor was really even access to external consultants, right? It's access to high quality but affordable access to external consultants were seen to be as a driver for technology adoption, some of the larger firms, but small firms apparently didn't have access to. So these are just some of the factors that I mentioned, and hopefully that contributes to sort of the framework or analytical framework that you mentioned. And in terms of what ADB does, or should do, I'm handicapped by the fact that I'm fairly new to ADB, but I'll do my best. So going straight to the core of what we do as a development bank, and downstream is really the sovereign and non-sovereign financing, and the specific projects that promote SME digital adoption seems to be far and in between, or they may be embedded in some of the projects. So I wasn't able to find great examples. But what I did find is that we do provide investment in the ecosystems and enablers. So we can probably call it a rising tides, lifting all boat approach, if you will. Right. So this consists of investment in digital infrastructure or other technology enablers. From digital technology point of view, the enablers would be the transfer electricity or even digital government services that have direct or indirect impact in overall adoption of digital services. Improving access to financing for SME, which is a big initiative of ADB. Promoting fintech, which also has an outsized benefits to smaller firms, or even our work in improving the quality of education, closing the skills gap, especially around industry IR 4.0, between the market demands and the pipeline. Those are all important initiatives. But perhaps less known and perhaps underestimated is our work in midstream and upstream, right? Our midstream work, our OPP's advisory, for example, in supporting DMCs prepare bankable projects to attract more private capital. PPP has been working really hard to identify more digital opportunities, and I think they will. They'll be bearing fruit very soon. And the upstream work that the ERCD does, for example, or the policy reform work that Carmen's team does, for example, those are all important contributor to promote and improve the enabling environment for digital adoption. A specific example that our team does, we've just launched a TA. Sorry, it's actually Pakistan Western Missions TA that we are partnering to help diagnose the digital ecosystems and promote digital services sector. We were just recently in Vietnam. Again, we were asked to help them come up with ICT industry policy with an outsized focus on SMEs. So I think we do have an important role. We can probably do more, but I think it's important not to lose sight of all the work that ADB does, around the external factors and complementary enablers.
Well, thank you, Yoni. And I think well, first, it's great for us to have a fresh pair of eyes and to have this fresh look as a newcomer in ADB. But I think for the newcomer, I think you absorbed already a lot of ADB jargon and ADB concepts that we use, right? Upstream, downstream, or PPPs and all that. But I think it's also very important what you said about infrastructure and also policy side. And of course, when I mentioned earlier that there are different regions, different countries with different levels of development. Of course, we are talking about a low-income country, let's say, with most of the country or a big part of it, let's say, rural areas without just simple internet access. It is quite hard to talk about digitalization and trade finance. Then the question is, what do we do about that as an ADB? Do we work on it on the public sector side or on the private sector side? And I think the consensus so far in ADB is that our previous efforts in digitalization on the sovereign side have not been all that, not surprisingly, successful. And so really, we do believe that perhaps private sector should be really more involved, or at least PPPs, from the investment point of view. But the role of the governments, of the public sector side, of the sovereign side in regulations and policy cannot be underestimated. I think this is very important. And one thing that I also wanted to reflect when Kijin was making his presentation, and if you guys recall, there was a last slide on policy considerations, and I think Kijin put it in legislation, interoperability, green and inclusive trade, and digital divide. And I actually, even at that stage, Kijin, I was going to ask you, where do you put issues of privacy, let's say, regulations, because this is some big concerns in some of our countries, especially in countries with very authoritarian regimes. It is an issue. We cannot just put it under the rug. Anyway, so let me move on. Again, this is just some reflections, and maybe we can discuss later. We still have a bit of time. But let me move now to James. And I think, again, this is a very good connection with the previous speakers, James, because you're working in ASEAN. And of course, ASEAN is one of the regions with kind of advanced activities and some progress in this area. So the whole region was working really hard to push forward digitalization agenda. And we learned that all 10 members of ASEAN are now connected in the ASEAN single window. And basically all this electronic exchange of documents and all that are done. And we are wondering if you can reflect now whether it is done smoothly, the progress has been going well, because this is a very good, inspiring example for other subregions. I'm working, as I mentioned, early in Central and West Asia. So we have a CAREC program, Central Asia Regional Economic Cooperation Program, which includes 11 countries, including East Asia, China and Mongolia, including South Asia. So it will be good to have a correct single window. So what can we learn from an ASEAN single window, if you can reflect on your work in that area in ASEAN? Please, James.
Thank you, Lasisa, and congratulations to ERCI for organizing this very interesting webinar and dialogue. As you said, in ASEAN, the work on the digital economy and digital integration has really proceeded very early as 2006. They've already been discussing some of the groundwork, especially on the legal framework. And let me just step back a bit and discuss the overarching approach of ASEAN in terms of strengthening the digital economy and facilitating digital integration. As you know, in ASEAN has so many agreements. They have the ASEAN Digital Master Plan. They have the ASEAN Digital Integration Framework. They've already completed the ASEAN Agreement on E-commerce, and they also conducted this ASEAN Single Window. And the purpose of this ASEAN Digital Master Plan and the ASEAN Digital Integration Framework is really to develop the policy framework, the overarching institutions to deliver the full potential of the digital economy and digital integration. And they've identified around 7 areas that they need to work on to do this work. And one of them, the first one, is really facilitating seamless trade across the different countries. And this is where the ASEAN single window comes in. They are also looking at developing regulations in terms of protecting data, while at the same time supporting digital trade and innovation. A third part of this huge and overarching framework to really integrate the region digitally is also the development of safe and secure digital payment system that are interconnected. At present, this is working at the national level, not the regional level. A fourth pillar that they are also focusing is on broadening the digital talent base. Earlier, there was a discussion. I mentioned that you also need to enhance the capacity to make some of this improvement in the digital space happen. And because when you talk about the digital economy and digital integration framework, the private sector comes in. Most of these agreements are also targeting the fostering and the development of digital entrepreneurship, particularly lifting not only for the big companies or, for example, the high tech companies, but also especially for SMEs, because as we know in ASEAN, about 90% of the firms and also 80% of employment are coming from MSEs, SMS, SMSE, MSMEs, and they are also looking at coordinating regional national policies at the regional level. So these are the big buckets that they are working on. And in terms of the first target on facilitating seamless trade, as you already mentioned, in 2019, the 10 ASEAN member economies have already gone live in terms of the operation of the ASEAN single window. So this single window allows the granting of preferential tariff treatment based on the Atiga e-form, the exchange through the single window. As of this single window will continue to open opportunities for ASEAN economies within and across the region to exchange trade-related documents, such as the ASEAN Customs Declaration document, the ASEAN Electronic Phytosanitary Certificate, and even the Electronic Animal Health Certificate. So this allows the exchange of these important documents. So in 2021, we know that Cambodia, Philippines, Singapore, Thailand, Malaysia, and Myanmar have already entered live operation of the ASEAN Customs Declaration document, and they've already counted the number of documents that have been exchanged. Uh, in 2021, ASEAN member states are also exploring and negotiating the possibility of exchanging trade-related documents not only within the ASEAN region, but with its biggest six dialogue partners. This includes the US, of course, China, Japan, Republic of Korea, Australia, and New Zealand. And this will even expand the benefits that this ASEAN single window can actually deliver to the region. There are also other important developments that are happening in the digital initiative, and one of these is really the ASEAN Customs Transit System, or which we call ACT. This has also gone live, but during the COVID, it slowed down a bit because of the border closure. But because the borders are gradually opening, this ASEAN Customs Transit System is slowly opening up. And what it allows is it allows the private sector, it allows the movement of goods by road from a port of departure in an ASEAN member state to a point of destination in another member state, without the need to unload the goods that are being carried in trucks that crosses the borders, and with minimal procedures at the border point. So again, this will help facilitate the seamless flow of goods and services. And we know that ASEAN already completed the agreement on e-commerce, and this is an initial step really to develop the benefits from digital economy. We know that e-commerce is really booming, especially during the lockdown. And this agreement strengthens the emergence of a cohesive, aligned, and inclusive environment to facilitate the cross-border e-commerce transaction for goods and services. I'll stop here. Lesisa, back to you.
Thank you, James. This is very interesting and certainly a lot of things to learn from ASEAN as always. So we may get back to you, us from other regional or sub-regional programs. Well, I am going now to continue our discussion. I just wanted to mention that we don't have much time left, but I hope we'll have at least another round because I have personally a lot of questions. I still urge people who are still here with us, and we have a lot of people in the seminar. Please do write your questions or suggestions or maybe clarifications or share your opinion in the chat box. We will try to voice it. So with that, let me go now to Hannah. Hannah, actually, I saw your camera on and you're on now, so this is good. The only thing that I would like to ask you guys, all of you, to be a little bit briefer, shorter, concise in your responses, because let's try to cover as much as possible questions today. So it's actually quite interesting thing that I wanted to ask you, Hannah, now. And it's very important. It's a little bit philosophical question in my view, but I think it's really important to reflect on that. Of course, we have a lot of model laws. We have ancestral model law. We have other laws that we mentioned today. And it's very important. We usually in ADB urge and promote them among our countries. The current international framework working in digital exchange and digitalization and trade, of course, it is highly complex thing, right? I mean, unless you specialize in that, unless you have you devote your time and resources and you learn about these things, these things is not something that you easily pick up and do. So also these things, they cover initiatives across various industries. So the current international framework, in your view, is it good enough to really enable global digital standards? It's a tall endeavor, it's a tall order. So in your view, what steps are lacking or where the gaps are and where more work is needed? And also importantly, what is it that organizations like ours, like ADB, multilateral development institutions, can do to help in that?
Yes. Okay.
Yep.
And now I can see myself. So this is
Yes,
not a
good.
technology day for me. So, but it's good that you can hear me. To your question, it's absolutely right that I think in this day and age we see a lot of developments on the multiplication of different trade agreements, especially the new age digital trade agreements or DEAs, right? And I think increasingly we see more being added to that digital noodle bowl, as that term used by our friend Jan Duval at ESCAP. So it's very complex to keep track of all of these different developments. But I think what is good news and what is encouraging in my view is that increasingly I think they reference the kind of developments that we want to see. So the case in point is, as Kijin spent quite some time, and also Carmen spent some time talking about the importance of having an enabling legal environment for digital trade. Right, so we need more countries to adopt the UNCITRAL model law on electronic transferable records. So the good news is that both at the global level and bilateral level, we see a lot of these agreements referencing the need to or the endeavor to actually adopt such the model law. Right, so at the global level, we see the e-commerce JSI that UK and Singapore has actually reintroduced this provision so that countries will actually endeavor to establish a legal framework consistent with MLETA. And similarly, at the bilateral level, we see, let's say, the DEPA between Chile, New Zealand, and Singapore, and also the Singapore-Australia Digital Economy Agreement, both kind of referencing the same endeavor effort as well. And of course, last week we just heard, UK and Japan announcing their digital partnership, and we see digital trade standards being on that list. So I think the good thing is they are referencing the right stuff, right? But I think the challenge for me, and I'll be brief about this, is that the challenge is how how fast is the follow-on implementation from that endeavor, from that commitment, just like the G7 who has been, expressing the commitment to actually harmonize the legal environment within the G7. As of today, we still have quite a few countries in the G7 at various stages of the process. Some of them are a bit more advanced, but some of them haven't been making as much progress as we would like to, right? So that's the question. And the second thing, I think the challenge is, do we have enough guidance and preparation for both governments and businesses to actually get ready once those commitments in the trade agreements are actually valid, right? So for that, again, I would stress the need for capacity building and really already piloting some of these things before the law comes into effect. So we're very happy to see again some of the pilots already. For example, under the UK, Singapore, DEA, they're already testing some of the standards before the law actually takes effect in UK. And also, really thinking about what we can do together with ADB. I think education and training for both public sector and private sector remains important. So for that, what we have done also this year, in fact, just last month, we released an online education course. It's called Certificate in Digital Trade Strategy with our ICC Academy Education arm. And that's a tool to actually help both policymakers and business leaders to actually think about what are the pieces of the puzzle that they need to actually look at and determine their own path, right, for their economies and their companies as they take advantage of this new digital economy. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Hannah. Thanks very much. Yeah, so you mentioned things on commitment and implementation, and if anything, if we go by climate change commitments and COPs experience and so on, I hope that kind of global community will be much better in sticking to commitments and implementation when it comes to digitalization and trade. Also, piloting and capacity building, what you mentioned, I think it's extremely important, obviously. And here again, if you just give me 1 second, I just wanted also to share that in CAREC program, Central Asia Regional Economic Cooperation Program, we have a lot of activities on e-commerce and digitalization and digital trade and in trade facilitation. So again, those of you who are interested can find more information. And I'll just share, my experience that it's been anything but easy work to agree among different countries in this program on same standards and basically standardization in electronic trade and so on. So I'd like to now turn actually to Carmen again and talk about the trade and supply chain finance program. And of course, Carmen, nowadays everybody knows, that ADB is becoming a climate bank. So it's a big agenda that we take very seriously and we mainstream it everywhere. So I'm pretty sure that there is kind of more sort of pressure on you guys also to make global trade and supply chains more green, more resilient, socially responsible, right? Inclusivity and transparency. This is something also applied to supply chains and trade finance. So what do you guys do about this, and how do you respond to these challenges? Again, very quickly, if you can share with us, Carmen.
Sure. I think one of the key pillar of our program, and it actually touch upon social, environmental, and in ESG in general, it's transform the global supply chains. So I think under the umbrella of digitalization, we have some pilot initiatives going on within the team. So we have a gender initiative in which we partner with our DMC banks to enhance policies so they can actually target and address female clients and SME lead by women in a way that they can engage and they can provide suitable financing and targeted financing. In the green aspect, we also have a climate a kind of green facility, and we make sure all commitments from our banks that are green can be addressed and the finance can be provided in a timely manner. Also, from a pilot perspective, we are we have ongoing a very interesting initiative, which is actually partnering with the GS1, which is a quite unknown a non-profitable organization, which is all the QR codes that you can see around the globe. It's made by this company, and we are trying to partnership in order to trace global supply chains from the smaller suppliers to the big buyers and the distributors. So everything, if you see from like a more broader perspective, leads to digitalization, because we need to make global supply chains digital in order to address these key issues that we face as a society. So I think once we are enabled a digital trade ecosystem, trade will cost less, will be more inclusive. We could be able to address SMEs, which are the backbone of growth, jobs, and the economy in general. So on the kind of getting back to digitalization and maybe picking up on what Hannah was mentioning about capacity building, we are being very kind of active to engage with our DMCs. And something I wanted to share is that when we first addressed this and we went to speak to DMCs along with the DSI, we were offering policy reform. So we wanted to kind of help governments to analyze the legislative framework and provide a path forward for enhancement and align to MLTR. And then we realized there was not enough awareness of what's MELITA. And when there was awareness, it was difficult to find a home for the actual policy reform, because sometimes underlying laws that rules these trade documents are spread among different agencies. So we have stepped back, and kind of the pillar for our digitalization agenda is capacity building. And with capacity building, we address both the knowledge sharing, and we have in partnership with Ancitral, we have now kind of in-depth paper that we share with our DMCs before we actually speak to them on what's MELITA as a way of background. And then we try to build the knowledge through capacity building. And this week, we have pilot one of the first of a series of sessions. Actually, DSI was there, ICC. We had some legal experts, so we are trying to build the ground for a policy reform kind of phase when we can actually engage with the government to analyze the legislative setting and provide that enhancement. And we really believe this is crucial for resiliency, sustainability, green finance, kind of the key pillar for the future. And I will stop there so we can continue with the panelists. Thank you.
Thank you, Carmen. Yes, I know there is a lot to say and a lot to share. So no, it's very interesting and good things. And all these new requirements is making your program more complex and more difficult. But nevertheless, I think these are all in the right direction, and they should be as such. So very quickly, maybe now I'll turn to Yoni, but before I do that, I also wanted to mention that I will still give, we are getting a little bit closer to our session, but I still would like to give opportunity for all of you to actually reflect on what each one of you said, and maybe if you have some opinions, let me know. I mean, we will give a few minutes for that. So maybe, yeah, Yuni, I alluded to that in the previous question that I asked you. We talk about the gap in digitalization kind of adoption between large and small firms. But obviously, the most obvious probably gap exists between countries, right? And we talked today about different levels of developments between countries, but also between regions, maybe. So what do you think? What is your view? Is it really a matter of funding mostly? Or are there maybe other market failures that need to be addressed through regulatory reforms, through some policy dialogue, policy work in developing countries? What do you think about that?
the short answer to that question is an absolute yes. Funding is very, very important, and there's a really large funding gap, probably not as large as the trade finance gap, but ITU estimates that in order to achieve universal broadband coverage by 2030, the world needs to invest something to the tune of $450 billion, and large part of which needs to come from the private sector, but at least a third needs to be funded by the public sector. So alludes to the importance of funding, both from the private, which has been the case historically, but there is also an increased call for public financing, both from government as well as multilateral banks such as ADB. But the point you're making around policy reforms and regulatory reforms cannot be underestimated either. Like as you mentioned, the issue around privacy law. Those are fundamental regulatory frameworks that underpin the digital economy. That's what builds the trust. That's what promotes adoption, and a lot of our DMCs are struggling to update their views, their legislations in line with what they view as best practice. But then the world is fractured. There are different approaches on data governance, and the efforts by ASEAN, for example, which is longstanding and has made great progress. But in terms of interoperability, if not harmonization of different regimes, which also promote cross-border data flow and trade, is still faced with a lot of challenges, right? So this fundamental digital economy policies is critical, and ADB does have few projects across OGC, policy reform by the trade finance team, our team, that really help DMCs improve those. But what the best practice is still it's a nebulous problem, as you mentioned. I was reminded of the time that I was still with Telenor, when I was sitting across the table from the government. They were requesting data of our clients, of our customers, and when you know that the governments may not be using them for purposes that are innocuous, then you're sort of trapped because you're sitting between the government and customers. So it's a difficult challenge, but it's something that we definitely have to get more involved so that we can promote best practice, or at least more human-centered and human rights approach in this space. But more specifically, when it comes to digital infrastructure, we talk about market efficiency gap and true access gap. So true access gap are the remote areas that you mentioned, where it's just too expensive for private sector to enter because it's low density, low income. There's just no business case, in which case the government definitely has to come up with some kind of smart subsidy to fill the gap, and that there is some innovation that can be made from technology as well as business model perspective, but there are areas that will always be unconnected if left to the private sector. But market efficiency gap also exists, especially in heavily regulated industries such as telecommunications. So policy reforms that can promote more competition and reduce the cost of network rollout around licensing, spectrum allocations, or rights of way can go a really long way. And a lot of our DMCs, there's a lot of headroom for them to really look at their sectoral regulations as well when it comes to digital adoption. So I'll stop here.
Yeah, very good. Very interesting. Discussion on that, and continuing from this country kind of gap in digitalization, maybe I now actually ask James, to follow up on your story in ASEAN, but also to follow up on what Yoin was talking about on digital gap. In your region, James, in Southeast Asia, obviously there are lots of smaller economies, right? And those who have perhaps less funding, less resources available. So how are they really progressing in digitalizing trade? And also from ADB side, what assistance or what support we've been providing to them to facilitate the progress and contributing to this narrowing of the digital divide? James.
I was saying that that's really a very critical issue that we need to address in terms of how to bring along the smaller economies in this digitalization journey. And we know markets like Laos, Cambodia, Myanmar are really in preliminary stage when we look at digitalization and application of e-commerce. They have very low level of infrastructure. The cost of accessing internet is quite high, and they, in terms of payment service, most of these economies still prefer to transact in cash, and they don't have digital payment system. In Cambodia, where there is sufficient infrastructure for ICT, uh, capacity in terms of skills are lacking, and also the speed of the internet is still very low. The cost of electricity is still very high. I think ADB is, I think, trying to address the gap for these smaller economies by developing three critical area, and one has already been discussed, is the development of a simple but adequate legal framework. And because this will really facilitate the transition of this backward, low income economy into a digital economy. And this will reduce uncertainty, as what Yoni Jong said. It will enhance trust and also address potential harm. And this requires investing in capacities of lawmakers, government officials, and other stakeholders who are in the front and center in terms of developing some of these law on electronic commerce, electronic signature, in terms of data regulation, in terms of data privacy. I think the second important work that ADB is also doing is really the development of a secure and reliable digital identity system, and we have done this in, for example, in Papua New Guinea through the DigiSen. This is critical because this will enable the citizens' full participation in the digital economy. A robust system of digital identity will help cover risk and challenges related to digital identification, which we know is very important if we want to roll out the application of this digital technology in market transaction. I think the third area that we ADB needs to also invest is actually improving the national statistics on information technology and the use of e-commerce. Presently, there is a dearth of data on statistics on ICT, e-commerce, and the application of digital economy. And this is like a handicap in terms of the formulation and evaluation of digital development policies. I think we need to improve the quality of statistics and then the quantity of national statistics to support the formulation and evaluation of digital development policies. And of course, underlying all this is really the large investment that was mentioned earlier in terms of the digital infrastructure. One thing I would like to probably mention, Laziza, is that we need to also customize the type of technology that we will use in our DMCs, because I think we shouldn't use the same type of technology. There are high technology like the 4G, the 5G. They will not be adaptable to our lower middle income economies or lower income economies. We need to go through the spectrum of technology and use them, and then allow some interoperability between the different types of technology, because I think that's the only way that we can really reach out the underserved members of our community. I stop here, Laziza. Back to you.
Yeah, thank you, James. Good reflections and really, yeah, good point on no size fits all in this case. And I think tailored, very specific approach perhaps is in order. So we have a lot more, but unfortunately we are already a little bit above our allocated time. So we have here other people. Let me just take 1 second and ask if any in our audience would like to share their views. We you know, on everything that has been said, you know, maybe to reflect, to disagree, perhaps even, that's okay. We have people from, I think, resident missions here, I think country representatives also I see here Thomas from SDCC and Yubin from RCI unit. So it's really a lot of people from various parts of the bank. So let me know. Just raise your hand if you'd like to, share your views, your comments, observations on these things. No more questions. We are closing the seminar soon, but your views are still welcome. But in the meantime, while you think on those, so don't be shy, just raise your hand there or turn your camera on. Perhaps if I can really conclude this session, I think it's been really, I hope, 1.5 hours worth spending and learning something. We all urge you to go to this very simple, not very long, short policy brief, very interesting with a lot of information. And again, many thanks to Kijin and his team, obviously to Sinyong for leading this work. And just to reflect on things that we've heard, maybe if I can just summarize very quickly, not doing a very good justice to that, but at least something that was appealing to myself as a moderator, is we've heard a lot about capacity building here, the need for that, countries need it. And if not that, then and if not us, who will be doing this very important work, bringing this knowledge and these standards and making it applicable to countries and affordable also. Building coalitions, I think, very important. All these development member countries will have to be at the table when these standards are being shaped up globally or regionally. With advanced economies driving this process, but developing member countries, including UMICs, upper middle income countries, middle income countries, but also low income countries, they have to have a voice in that. And I think our role as ADB is very important in this process. Funding, of course, a big elephant in the room, very important as well. And now with reorg, the way we are moving towards providing solutions, being a solutions bank, and without really distinguishing between sovereign and non-sovereign side, but really bringing a package of assistance, I think we are positioning ourselves better on the new operating model for this work. Simplicity of legal frameworks, something that James just mentioned, extremely good point. I think for sure, again, with complexity of this thing and reliance on consultants a lot, I think to make these things as simple as possible will be a very tall order, and I think very, very much needed. But also, I think this seminar, this type of webinar also shows the importance of learning from each other, right? And we've heard about this good example from ASEAN single window. And already, I'm sure some of us working in other sub-regional programs, we are thinking along this way. And we know that this is a good example, and we can talk about that. And it's also knowledge sharing. So please continue this work. And I really have to say that I think from Sinyon's team in ERCI, so many knowledge products in that area in trade, RCI and trade, including digitalization and digital trade is coming out, which actually reflects and is relevant and involves other people from the bank, from SDCC, digital technology for development unit, us in regional departments. Also OGC, we mentioned today OGC's RETA on legislation. Our own correct work, again, we have a correct digital strategy, and we are looking at e-commerce stuff. So there's so much of information and knowledge and experiences, what worked, what have not worked, what is working best, what is not working best. So that type of knowledge sharing is very important, and that's where we have all this wisdom and experience being learned. So with all that, thank you so much to our panelists for sharing your views, taking your time, and sharing your experiences on this. But most of all, many thanks to Kijin and to Aleli, and also to Sinyong. I hope you guys are still there. Yes, I see you're still here, obviously. So thank you all for that. And I think this webinar is closed.
Thank
Kijin?
you.
Yep. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It
Thank
was
you.
Thank you
excellent.
so much, everybody.
Well done.
Thank
Thank
you
you
very
all.
much.
Happy holidays.
Happy holidays.
Happy
Happy holidays.
holidays. That's right. Happy holidays. Thank you.